I've decided to start a new series on my channel called Head to Toe. In this series, I plan to build as detailed a collection of shooting form breakdowns as I possibly can. I'm going to move in a slow and deliberate fashion through a player's entire shooting technique and point out anything that I consider to be relevant and why I think it's relevant. I know that many of you who watch this channel are here to hear my thoughts on shooting form, and this series is going to be my answer to that. I've decided to start with D'Angelo Russell, a player that I've never broken down before. However, in future episodes of this series, I do plan on returning to some of the players that I've already covered, like Klay Thompson and Damian Lillard, because I feel that my previous breakdowns failed to do their techniques justice. In those videos, I only made 3 or 4 points about each player's technique. I hope to make many more in each episode of this series, and as a result, I expect these videos to be pretty long. So, without further delay, let's get right into Russell's technique. I'm going to start from the bottom of his form, from his feet, and move up through his entire body to the actual release itself, despite the name of this series, which suggests that it would be the other way around. In terms of information, the end result is going to be the same, but I just think that it's more logical to start from the base of the shot. Russell has somewhat funky technique, and I think his feet help to explain why his shot looks odd, but not necessarily bad. His right foot, which is his non-shooting side foot, usually points towards the basket, but his shooting side foot tends to point more inwards, as if it was rotated towards the center point of his body. I think the best way to think about his foot angle is in relation to his overall body turn. Russell has a significant turn in his shot, meaning that his shooting side shoulder, his left shoulder, sits further forward in space than his right shoulder relative to the basket. Because Russell's entire body is turned, it actually makes sense that his left foot points to the right of the basket rather than directly towards it, like his right foot often does. I think what's happening with Russell's feet is that they're actually pointing a little bit towards each other, but because his entire body is rotating to the right, his right foot ends up looking like it faces towards the basket, and his left foot looks like it's turned significantly inwards. If Russell's body was perpendicular to the basket, his feet would both point slightly in towards the center line of his body. A lot of NBA players' feet point inwards when they go to shoot. It doesn't always look the same because of the varying amount of turns that they each exhibit, but an inward angle of the feet is often present. Here's Kevin Durant as a more exaggerated example. I think the inward turning of the feet is closely tied to the angle of the knee and leg during the knee bend portion of the shot. Because Russell's feet do not flare outwards, his knees bend in a similarly contained fashion. Your knees are biologically limited to follow the angle that your foot takes. They only bend on one axis, and the direction that they bend is reflected by where your feet are pointing. So if your feet point inwards, your knees will also bend inwards. Or at least, they'll look like they're bending inwards, but they're really still bending straight relative to where your foot is pointing. If your feet point outwards, your knees would also bend outwards. But this is far less common in the NBA, suggesting to me that it's not conducive to efficient shooting. By keeping your knee bend contained within the limits of the width of your body, like Russell does, I believe that you prevent sideways forces from entering your shot. This is, of course, the ultimate goal of perfecting shooting technique. After all, if you have no sideways forces in your shot, you only have to contend with the distance to the hoop. In terms of the width of Russell's stance, I'd say he has a fairly normal stance. It isn't particularly wide or narrow. His shooting side foot is about a foot further forward in space than his non-shooting side foot relative to the basket, and they're both just within his shoulder width. Interestingly, Russell's form does change depending on the situation that he finds himself in. This is actually the case with most players, as having identical technique every single time you shoot is extremely difficult, if not impossible, not to mention that different in-game situations call for different techniques because of the varying forces acting on your body. Before going into this, I would like to point out that these changes are mostly subconscious, as the body is extremely capable of adjusting to its environment without a conscious input. As you can see here, Russell's stance has widened significantly. Because he's shooting off the dribble and moving to the right, it makes sense that his right foot is now located further away from his left foot. This wider stance allows Russell to absorb his left to right momentum and rise vertically into his shot instead of leaning towards one side. This points to a larger theory of shooting technique, which is that if something has to change in different shooting situations, it should be your feet or your legs rather than your upper body. Your legs, while important for generating force, are really there to stabilize your upper body to allow your arms to carry out a consistent release of the ball. If you're changing what your hands do based on the situation that you find yourself in, say like a fadeaway or an explosive off-the-dribble shot, you will not be as consistent as you possibly could be. Next, I'd like to talk about Russell's lower body mechanics in relation to his upper body mechanics. Russell is a one-motion shooter. A good test of one-motion versus two-motion shooting is to see how the set point relates to the jump off the ground in terms of timing. With a one-motion shot, as the player's feet leave the ground, the ball simultaneously starts to leave the location of the set point, and the arms start to extend forward to perform the push and release of the ball. This is what we see with Russell. It's also possible that the ball starts to leave the set point as the player's feet are still in contact with the ground. This is kind of like a sped up one-motion shot. Or a one-motion shot on steroids, so to speak. And we see it with players like Trae Young. However, with a two-motion shot, even as the feet lose contact with the ground, the ball does not leave the set point. The ball can be in the set point position, but the arms do not begin to extend forward until the player has achieved some level of lift off the ground. The difference is really only a fraction of a second, but the end result is quite different, and players with two-motion shots look distinctive because of this slight difference in relative timing. This difference really gets to the core of my beliefs about shooting technique. I think that one-motion shots, where the ball leaves the set point as your feet leave the ground, or earlier, allow for a greater transfer of power from the legs to the arms, and therefore the ball, when compared to a two-motion shot. One-motion shots are the reason why the NBA is currently loaded with players who can shoot effectively from well beyond the NBA three-point line. In fact, try to name 5 current NBA players with two-motion shots who can consistently shoot from beyond the NBA three-point line. You might be able to, but I promise you that I can name you many times more players who do so with a one-motion shot, like Russell. Players like Ray Allen are not the rule, but rather the exception to the rule. And, finally on this point, I promise you that you won't be able to shoot like Ray Allen unless you're at least 6'5" and of a similar build with similar athleticism. Normal people simply cannot generate the force necessary to reach the rim from three-point range, only using their arms and a small input from their legs. Throw in the full power that your legs are capable of producing, and all of a sudden, the game changes. That really is the core of a one-motion shot. Now, when you get to the mid-range game, things change. The closer you are to the basket, the more likely it is that your arms can generate the force necessary to reach the rim. So it's possible to be an elite mid-range shooter who can't shoot from three-point range. It's also possible to shoot a one-motion shot when shooting from three-point range, and shoot a two-motion shot when you're closer into the basket. This is actually what I propose to players looking to achieve an elite level of play. Returning to Russell, I'd like to move away from the legs and into the upper body mechanics, which might be even more complicated, so bear with me. Before I get into that, I'd like to note that I do go off on large tangents, especially in the latter half of this video, so please leave your thoughts on how closely you'd like me to stick to one player's technique in future videos. Russell has a small dip in catch-and-shoot situations. Anyone who says that they don't dip is either lying or incorrect, because it's pretty much impossible to shoot consistently by only starting your shot from the height at which you catch the ball. Here, the ball contacts Russell's hand at shoulder height. The ball stays around his stomach level throughout his dip after he brings it down to that level. Interestingly, Russell, and in fact most people, don't just dip with their arms. Rather, because they bend their knees when they shoot, their entire upper body lowers towards the ground. So, while the ball may not dip relative to the stomach in Russell's case, it does dip relative to the ground itself, because Russell's entire body is dipping as well. This is, I think, an underappreciated part of the dip. People only think of it as a movement that the arms carry out relative to the body, but it's actually a part of the entire body movement itself, because it's a part of the storing of energy before the explosion into the shot. Moving to Russell's raising of the ball, we can see that the ball is actually significantly extended away from his body. I looked into this presence of distance between the ball and the body during the raising of the ball from its lowest point to the set point, and I found that it's actually quite uniform across most NBA players. Of course, there is some variation, but I think that's more of a natural result of the length of our arms and the way that they're slightly bent as we dip and raise the ball. For example, here's Steph Curry displaying a similar amount of distance between his body and the ball relative to his overall size. I think this is a matter of personal preference rather than absolute technique values, like one motion versus two motion shooting. Looking at the timing of Russell's ball raise, something extremely important is revealed. He starts to raise the ball from its lowest point to his set point as his legs are still bending and lowering. Then, midway through the ball raise movement, Russell's legs stop bending and start extending. There's essentially a flip in the middle to late part of Russell's ball raise, which is really the most important flip of a jump shot. This is, namely, the flip from lowering your body and loading power to extending your body and releasing that pent-up power. Because Russell raises the ball early relative to his extension, the ball is quite close to his set point when his lower body starts to explode and extend. This means that when the ball moves through his set point and beyond, his legs are in their most explosive stage, allowing them to transfer their power into his arms during the time where his arms actually need power to aid the pushing of the ball towards the basket. The best counterexample of what not to do that I can think of is LeBron James's free throws. People have come up with all kinds of elaborate explanations as to why LeBron can't really shoot free throws at an elite level, despite him being one of the all-time great basketball players, who's undoubtedly shot hundreds of thousands of free throws in his life. My explanation is quite simple, and it's closely related to the point that I made about Russell's ball raise timing. LeBron has experimented with pretty much everything about his free throws, like his bounce and his ball flip routine, his step up to the line, and even his stance. However, he's not actually changed the shot motion itself, which I think has a fundamental flaw in it. As you can see, when the ball starts to approach his set point, his legs are already fully extended, meaning that his knees are locked and his heels have come off the ground as high as they will. Because of this, when the ball moves through his set point and his arms start to extend towards the basket, which is the time when his arms would need the most benefit from some added power from his leg extension, his arms get no help from his legs because they're already fully locked out. In fact, his legs even absorb some power from his arms, as his heels tend to fall back towards the ground as his right arm extends forward. I made a video about this a while back, and it didn't get many views, but in that video, I listed the multitude of elite free throw shooters, including Steve Nash, Kevin Durant, and Kobe Bryant, to name a few, who time their free throws such that their legs extend concurrently with their arms, pushing the ball after the set point. I'd say that I'm 95% sure that this is why LeBron is only an average free throw shooter. It's the only common difference that he shares with pretty much every elite free throw shooter in the recent history of the game. Returning to Russell and his ball raise, I'd like to get into what I think is the most interesting part of Russell's technique. I addressed the gap between his body and the ball in his ball raise, but I didn't address the angle of the ball raise itself. As you can see here, Russell raises the ball significantly off the vertical plane of his eventual release. This is something that has become more prevalent in recent years. What it really means is that Russell's shooting hand, his left hand, is placed on the side of the ball as opposed to the rear of it as he raises the ball towards his set point. This is actually quite common because most people do not have the wrist, elbow, and shoulder flexibility to have their hand directly behind the ball and the ball directly in line with the eventual plane of release throughout the raising of the ball. Even Klay Thompson, a player with exceptionally straight technique, does not have the ball directly in the vertical line of his shot throughout the entire raising of the ball. It only enters that vertical line as the ball reaches his set point. As with pretty much everything I talk about in my videos, there's a spectrum to those technique points. Russell represents one extreme end of the spectrum, and Thompson represents the other extreme end of the spectrum. You will probably lie somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, But I think it's important that everyone is encouraged to experiment with each end of the spectrum to find out what works best for them, instead of assuming that everyone fits into the Thompson end of the spectrum in a kind of cookie-cutter mentality. The fact that Russell raises the ball off the center line of his set point and release is related to another huge part of his jump shot. This is the offhand thumb flick. Russell has a very significant and visible offhand thumb flick. You can see that his right hand thumb is spread over the top right surface of the ball before he goes to release it. Right when he starts to flick his left hand, aka his shooting hand, forward to perform the actual release of the ball, his right hand, aka his offhand, flicks forward too. You can see that his thumb has flicked forward as his thumb angle looks very different right after he releases the ball. You can see this from multiple angles. His thumb flicks forward simultaneously with his left hand flicking forward and losing contact with the ball. This means that, despite the strongly asserted convention that a two-hand shot is not good for shooting, Russell exhibits a consistent jump shot that utilizes a heavy input from his offhand thumb. Once more, this is a topic that I've tried to cover in other videos on this channel, and I've pointed out the multitude of elite shooters who use an offhand thumb flick in one way or another, such as Steph Curry and Kyrie Irving. In this video, however, I'd like to approach this issue of contention from a more theoretical perspective. In other words, is it logical that a thumb flick would necessarily make you a bad shooter? I already know the answer, which is no, because of examples like Curry, Kyrie, and Russell, but it's not necessarily intuitive. So think about it like this. To become a good shooter, you train many separate but related parts of your body to move as consistently as possible. For example, you train your legs to bend the right amount and at the right time. You train both your hands to catch the ball and locate themselves in the right place before you go up into your shot. You train your release hand fingers to contact the ball in a specific way as they flick forward and lose contact with the ball. My point is, why is it so hard to believe that you can train your thumb from your offhand to move consistently in relation to every other moving part in your shot? You do this over time with every moving aspect of your shot, so I don't think it's unreasonable to think that adding one more moving part is entirely possible. In fact, I'm leaning towards believing that it is a necessary part of a successful jump shot for some people, such as D'Angelo Russell, who are not comfortable bringing the ball up in a straight line underneath the line of their eventual release. If it is a fact of your biomechanics that you simply cannot keep your shooting hand palm directly behind and underneath the ball throughout the entire shot motion before the set point, then I don't see any good reason to force you to not have a thumb flick to adhere to some anachronistic principle. This is especially true in light of the examples of successful thumb flicking shooters that I've referred to endlessly, including Russell, who was a great shooter at Ohio State and has had flashes of shooting brilliance in the NBA, such as earlier this month when he hit 7 threes in one quarter against the Raptors. That brings us to the end of this analysis. If you enjoyed it or thought about something that you didn't think about before, then feel free to like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I try to read as many comments as possible, even if I don't reply to all of them. I really hope that this video is received well, because if it is, I'll continue to make videos in this series. I see a future where this is the main series that I upload to this channel, but it really depends on the reception that this video gets. Separately, I know that I speak as if I have authority on the topic of shooting technique. I think that I do have authority because I've thought about shooting technique more than most people have in the basketball community. It's just something that I've become extremely drawn to, which I acknowledge is quite abnormal. One of the things that I see in the comments that I take objection to is the idea that you have to be an elite NBA shooter to critique NBA shooting techniques. I particularly see this on videos where I critique NBA players' incorrect views on shooting technique. Some people refuse to look past the identity of the person giving them advice, instead of evaluating the advice itself in a vacuum. This is, frankly, a terrible idea that seems to persist particularly widely in the world of sport and basketball. Here's an analogy. If you were trying to build a plane, would you consult with the best pilot or the best aerospace engineer? One of them has the experience of operating a plane at the highest level, but the other has the knowledge of how a plane actually works. In reality, of course, you'd probably consult both to find out how to build a good plane structure as well as how to build a plane that pilots are happy to fly. But my point is that the aerospace engineer can obviously have insightful and valuable input into the construction of the plane. Returning to this situation, I'm not saying that I'm an aerospace engineer, but I am saying that I don't need to be a former NBA player to have valuable things to say about shooting technique. I hope that this video is proof of that, and if you're still watching at this point, you probably agree with me. With all that being said, if you are interested in how well I shoot, you should follow my shooting development on my Instagram page, which I've linked in the description. I've only been following and playing basketball for about 3 years now, which is something that not many people know or realize when they first come across my videos. Despite how recently I've discovered basketball, I think that I've made fairly significant progress in the area of shooting, and I attribute this largely to my ability to analyze other people's shooting techniques. Finally, thanks for watching, and make sure that you subscribe to see more episodes of this series in the future.